Hello everybody. I seem to be dazzlingly bright today on this video, but I haven't got time to be fiddling around with that. We're going to look at our next bit of 1 Corinthians this morning, and well, it's morning when I'm doing this, it may not be morning as you watch it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to go up to verse 16 this time. We'll look at the rest of the chapter next time, but it is worth mentioning that the whole chapter, as of course the whole letter, definitely fits together. So there are elements that we'll come on to look at in more detail next week that do have a bearing on some of the things we'll talk about today. And as we go into chapter 7, we're told, now for the matters you wrote about, at the beginning of that chapter. So Paul seems now to be getting on to discuss matters that specifically the Corinthian church, or at least a faction in the Corinthian church, have written to him about and asked his wisdom, his advice, his teaching about these issues. And in this chapter, the issues are mostly to do with marriage and sex and divorce and those sorts of issues. So that's what Paul talks about through this chapter. But he puts a number of broader principles in place as well that are important. It's in many ways a fascinating chapter and talks about things that, even though they may not all be directly relevant to our own personal situations, I'm sure have a lot to say to us. So let's have a look at what we're finding in chapter 7. In verses 1 to 6, Paul is particularly responding to this idea that the Corinthians have, which is translated in verse 1 as "it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman," or literally, "it's good for a man not to touch a woman," but that's what it would have meant. And I think what's often been misinterpreted here over the years, and has given Paul something of his reputation for being some sort of prude who doesn't like women, who doesn't think sex is okay, and all those kinds of things, is that it's been taken out of context. Because clearly, as we read the verses following, Paul is responding to a question about appropriate relationships within a Christian marriage. So he's talking about husbands and wives and how they relate to each other. And there was obviously some kind of feeling within the Corinthian church that sexual intimacy within marriage was impure, that actually if you wanted to be holy, you would devote yourselves to God and you wouldn't be distracted by these questions of sexual intimacy. And Paul actually responds quite emphatically by saying, no, that is not the case. So he encourages husbands and wives to continue to be sexually active and have that kind of intimate relationship with one another. He gives a provision, I suppose, for perhaps a particular short period of time where, by agreement, the husband and the wife might decide not to be sexually active because they're kind of pursuing prayer, but that should only be for a particular amount of time. And he recognizes that should a marriage not enable each partner to be sexually fulfilled, there is the danger that sexual immorality, adultery, comes into play. And he clearly sees that as an opportunity for Satan to get his hands on these Christian married people. One thing that's very remarkable about these verses, and about the whole chapter really, is that Paul clearly describes this marriage relationship between man and woman as an equal relationship. He says here that the wife's body is no longer her own because she yields it to her husband. And then immediately he says, and the husband's body is no longer his own because he yields it to his wife. This is about mutual submission in marriage, which is a radical thing for Paul to write about in this culture, and we need to hear that today. And it's good to note as we go through this chapter, there'll be more about this a little bit next week as well, but we see it here in verse 7. Paul says, I wish that all of you were as I am, by which he means he wishes that they were single. uh, as he now is. He doesn't say that is a necessity. He acknowledges that God's gifts are different for each person, and therefore that marriage is a gift to many people. But it's interesting that Paul has a very high view of singleness and celibacy for Christians. And that's something that we seem to have lost in the church. It's certainly not regarded that way in the broader society. And maybe we need to think about how we honour and affirm singleness and celibacy in our Christian communities. Paul moves through a number of other situations as well. He talks in verses 8 and 9 about those who are widowed. So where it's translated in the NIV, now to the unmarried and the widows, you'll see in the footnote, it may well be now to the widowers and the widows, men and women who've been widowed. And that's probably the likelihood here, is that he's talking specifically to people who've been widowed. And his advice to them is that they should remain single if they can. But again, there's that kind of down-to-earth recognition of human sexuality. Actually, if you need to get married, if you have, sexual urges are very, are sort of dominating you, don't be tempted into sexual immorality, but get married. And one of the interesting things here is that Paul says, as I do, stay unmarried as I do. Now, if he is just talking to widows and widowers, that suggests Paul probably had been married before, his spouse had died, and now he was single. And that makes sense, because within that Jewish culture that he was part of, it would have been very unlikely that he'd have been a single man, never married. Then in verses 10 and 11, he talks about divorce and separation. Again, he seems to be treating husbands and wives equally in this. He doesn't say, husbands, don't divorce your wives, and then leave it at that. He also says, wives, don't separate from your husbands. He uses a different word, probably because the wives in the Jewish culture weren't actually allowed to divorce, although they were in Roman culture. But he seems to be setting it up as an equal thing here. Husbands, don't divorce your wives. Wives, don't divorce your husbands. And perhaps he's setting that in the context of a broader pagan, but even Jewish understanding of divorce as not particularly serious. If a man decided to leave his wife and go and find another one, in some Jewish circles, that seemed to be quite normal. And in pagan society, certainly. And so Paul is wanting to say here, divorce has to be taken really seriously. Don't imagine as Christians that you can just kind of move from one marriage partner to the next. That mustn't be how we think of things as Christians. I'm sure that he's not undermining the complexity of marriage. I'm sure that the reality of broken marriages that can't be restored is not something that God is unaware of. But certainly Paul here wants us to know that divorce is not something to be taken lightly, that we really must work at ensuring marriage is that lifelong commitment that we declare at the outset. And he does say that this is from the Lord, this teaching, which seems to be referring back to the Gospels, Mark 10, for example, where Jesus teaches about marriage and divorce. But then he moves on to a different situation in verse 12, which is not something Jesus taught about. And Paul is very honest about that. He says, this is me speaking, not the Lord, because it's a new situation where you might have married couples, one of whom has become a Christian since they've been married. That would have happened a lot in Corinth. They've just heard the gospel in this city. So people who become Christians as they hear about Jesus may already be married, and they may be married to pagans who think this is completely crazy. And so the question is, well, what do we do? Does it, because we want to be pure and holy and serve Christ, does that mean we have to leave these pagan spouses? Well, Paul says, no, it definitely doesn't mean that. In fact, he says, your holiness, your being called to God, may well have a big impact upon your unbelieving spouse and your children. He says the children of a Christian parent are holy. Interesting. He says that the Christian spouse may well sanctify the unbelieving spouse. Now, exactly what Paul means by this is a little bit unclear. Presumably, he doesn't mean that these other people will be saved on the kind of coattails of their husband or wife, because that doesn't seem to fit in with how the New Testament speaks about our relationship with Jesus. But certainly it seems that the faith of the believer can have a real impact upon the lives of those close to them. And so Paul doesn't want those husbands and wives to walk away from unbelieving partners, but to persist in faithfulness and holiness. On the other hand, if their spouse decides they can't stay with their newly Christian husband or wife, they should allow their spouse to leave. If that's what they want, they shouldn't be bound. And Paul says that that's about being called to peace. Interesting, isn't it? That sometimes if people reject Jesus and walk away from us, the calling to lives of peace means we don't go haranguing that person, but we let them leave. Next time we're going to explore more about the context of this chapter. Is it about a particular crisis situation? Does Paul expect Jesus to come any minute? And some of the principles that Paul has for us about staying as we are in the life that we have when we're called by God. But there's plenty there to think about, and I'm going to put some questions this time in the description on YouTube, because they don't seem to stay on the screen for people to see very well. But let me just read a quick comment from Richard Hayes as I finish, because there's a bit of a contrast in this passage. On the one hand, you've got people saying, don't touch a woman. And on the other hand, last chapter, we read people saying, I'm free to do anything. I can do whatever I like. They seem like contrasts. Richard Hayes is quite interesting here. He says, there's an inner spiritual connection between these apparently antithetical claims and behaviors at Corinth. Some people saying, be, a kind of ascetic who doesn't indulge in anything. Other people saying, I can do anything I like and it's fine. Paul says, those who say I am free to do anything, and those who say I must abstain from everything, are equally setting themselves outside their God-given creaturely limitations. The attempt to escape our finitude, whether one way or the other, to escape the fact that we're just human beings who are limited, is bound to fail and to send us crashing down. That's why Paul gives simple, earthy counsel. Husbands and wives should cling together and fulfill one another's needs. And that's really interesting, how when we try to live outside of God's purposes and limitations upon us as human beings, we come crashing down. Anyway, I'll leave it there and look in the description on YouTube for the questions.